Hi everyone, Bart Jungens here with yet another video on HPE Morpheus VM Essentials. The topic for today is VM Essentials for the VMware Administrator. Why? Well, I want to give an answer on those questions that I get quite a lot lately from that typical VMware administrator who is looking for an alternative hypervisor and who is comparing features and functions. I hear you say a VM is a VM, which is true, but I make a comparison always with you're using a smartphone for plus 10 years with iOS as an operating system, and now you got to switch to an Android based smartphone. It's also a smartphone, it's just another operating system. And I'm not going to say that one is better than the other, it's another experience. Well, that's exactly the same when you're looking at the VMware console and then the VM Essentials management experience. It's the same, but it's a little bit different. Well, and that's what I'm going to show you today of how it compares and what are the differences in managing virtual machines. So, there are some topics that I've chosen, which are first of all an instance versus a virtual machine. Because Morpheus, Enterprise, VM Essentials are using a concept called an instance, which is most of the time a virtual machine, but not always. So let's get started with that one. Then the second question that I get quite often is then, hold on, I want to edit resources assigned to a virtual machine. Well, you will see when you hit that edit button on an instance on a VM that it's a little bit different and it's not actually what you expect to be there. So that is definitely something that we need to cover as well. Third one is then when assigning resources, well, Morpheus is using a mechanism called a service plan. And then, of course, the most commonly asked questions is where can I find vMotion and storage vMotion and HA and DRS? And then affinity rules. Does it happen there as well? Yep, it is. Where can I find it? Because it's at the same place, but it's a little bit different. And then also EVC mode, so enhanced vMotion capabilities. Where can I find that? And then finally, also when I'm doing maintenance, when I'm doing upgrades and firmware updates, well, can I put a host or do I need to put a host in maintenance mode? Well, also that is one of the things that I'm going to show you in this video. Are you ready? Let's get started. Now, before we dive into the GUI of VM Essentials itself, let's get started with the terminology and how these two virtualization solutions compare with each other, how they are the same or similar, and how they are different. So, if we talk about the hypervisor itself, of course, in the VMware space, it is called ESXi. In the VM Essentials environment, we're gonna call it HVM. So this is the HVM HPE Hypervisor virtualization solution, which is based, by the way, on KVM. Right. And then the hypervisor server, it's an ESXi host. We call it an HVM host in the GUI. And then, of course, a cluster, which is that ESXi cluster. Well, quite similar. We're talking about an HVM cluster. Well, then, of course, all this needs to be managed. Well, the hypervisor manager, which is vCenter in the VMware space, well, here it is then VM Essentials Manager. Let it be clear that HVM is the hypervisor. I hear and see some people say that VM Essentials is a hypervisor. Well, not really. It's HVM. That is the hypervisor based on KVM, and then VM Essentials with VM Essentials Manager is then the control plane. That's the GUI that you will see later on in this video. Because if we talk then about the virtualization solution itself, which is called vSphere, Well, here we're going to talk then about the HPE Morpheus VM Essentials software. So that's the software stack, the SKU that you're gonna buy, order. So that is actually then Morpheus VM Essentials, and this is where Morpheus comes in, because if we take then the big picture, if we go beyond virtualization, we're going to talk about orchestration and automation. Well, at that moment, you can compare this with VMware Cloud Foundation, and then the ARIA management stack that you see there in the portfolio. Well, this is then Morpheus Enterprise. So this is that software stack that exists already for more than 10 years, which is Morpheus Enterprise. Well, and this is from that stack that HPE decided to keep only the essentials to run VMs, and that is actually then VM Essentials. Well, if you get all this, let's switch to the GUI and look at the details of how it looks like. So here I am in the VM Essentials dashboard, where the first thing that I want to highlight is that we're working with so-called instances. Where you can find those, well, under provisioning, you will see that you can deploy those so-called instances. Now, what is an instance? Behind VM Essentials, all the code is based on Morpheus software. And with Morpheus Enterprise, you can deploy not only virtual machines, but also container-based applications and also bare metal deployments. And that's why with Morpheus, they generalize this, they put that abstraction layer in front of it, which is called an instance. And now with VM Essentials, in 99% of the cases, an instance will be one VM. So when you deploy a VM, technically you will be deploying an instance. Now, however, you have always those corner cases. If you take a good look, when I go to my instances, you can see that I have a lot of VMs deployed and running in my environment. And take an example of this Linux VM1 here. Effectively, there is one virtual machine. However, know that in some cases, let's say I have a web farm. Well, that web farm can have multiple virtual machines in that web farm. Well, take a look at this one, Alma VM01. It's an application based on Alma Linux. Well, here you can see that I have technically not one, but three virtual machines in that instance. And so that's the idea, that when I click on that instance called Alma VM01, well, technically you will see here that there are not one, but in this corner case, I have three VMs running in there called Alma VM01, but then -2 and -3. And they are running on host 1 and host 2 in my cluster. We'll come back to that later, but you see now that my VMs are distributed across the hosts in my cluster. Well, in my case, I have two hosts in my cluster, VME1 and 2, but as you can see, those VMs are distributed across those hosts. Now, if I go back to my Linux VM1, you will see that I only have, and this is normally what you will see, is that one VM that is sitting underneath my instance. But so this is a very important one already. I have an instance called Linux VM1, and underneath that instance, or behind that instance, I have also a VM, and it's the VM that is actually running on a host. And watch out for the next topic. When you click on this VM at that moment, you will see that I'm not in that instance view anymore, but now I am in the compute view. And so under compute, you will see other things than under the instances. The compute view is effectively the VMs who are consuming CPU and memory and all those resources, while an instance is indeed that management layer that Morpheus created in front of those VMs, knowing that Morpheus Enterprise, you can also run containers and bare metal deployments as well. Right, so know about the similarities, but also the differences between an instance and a VM. Because that's the second thing now. When I go back to my Linux VM here, second thing was, hey, I want to make a change to that VM. Well, know that I can go to my previous page, which is my instance, Linux VM 1. Well, at that moment, they will say, hey, Bart, I want to give more CPU and memory because this Linux VM has 1 core and 4 gig of RAM. Well, I want to change those resources. Well, typically in a VMware environment based on vCenter, you go, you click that edit button of that VM. Well, here, when you click here, that edit button, well, watch out. This is typically not what you might expect because I am editing that instance now here. So this is all metadata. I can change the name, put some tags and labels, and maybe change the owner, but this is all metadata. We are not changing here really the resources of that instance. Well, that's the second very important thing to be aware of. Don't use the edit button, but when you go to actions, there's an option called reconfigure. And so it's in reconfigure that you can select at that moment, this is what I'm looking for. For instance, I can give it now 2 CPUs and 8 gig of RAM and 2 CPUs and 16 gig of RAM. And I know those developers, they create it as small as possible, but you see this little tiny icon in here, right? That plus icon. Well, by clicking that plus icon, I can add a data drive, or I can add a additional network card, or I can add an additional storage controller, an IDE, a SATA, or the typical VirtIO block controller. So it's not in the edit, but it's in the reconfigure option that you can change those resources. Now, talking about those plans, because now these are pre-defined plans. Question will always come, hey Bart, I want to create a 2 CPU, 32 gig of RAM, or maybe a 4 CPU, 8 gig of RAM, or something else outside these plans. Well, yes, of course, you can change that. How can you do that? Well, for that, you have to go to administration. So at the top right, administration plans. Because again, this is Morpheus enterprise functionality in here. Morpheus being a cloud management platform. Technically, with Morpheus, you can also provision those instances not only on that HVM based or VMware-based environment, but also to plenty of other private and public clouds, like there is Nutanix, Azure Local, OpenStack, but also AWS, Azure, the public version, then Google, and several others. That's why we have those instances back again, and this is why you see all those plans as well. Now, just to be sure, what we can do here is let's take the one from VMware. Well, here you will see those predefined service plans. Well, at that moment, you can perfectly say with the add button, I want to add a service plan, and then create a service plan where I can say, well, that service plan will have 1 CPU, 8 gig of RAM, 40 gig of storage. So just fill in the name, and then here you will see then the storage, the memory, the core count, and the cores per socket. So you can choose to use those predefined plans, or yes, you can create also your own custom service plans as well. For the second part, I return here to the main provisioning dashboard, to my list of all my instances and VMs. And now let's take a look at how we do a live migration, or how we call it vMotion in a VMware environment. So if I return to my Alma VM01 instance, well, you can see that I have 3 VMs in there. 2 VMs are running on host VME1, and the third VM is running on host VME2. So let's say that I want to put all those VMs together. So what do I need to do? Well, I have to click on the VM, not on the instance, but on the VM. I am now in my compute view, not in the instance view, and I click on Actions. And now here you will see in the Actions menu of that VM an option called Manage Placement. And so that is what we are looking for. We're going to place that VM or control the placement of that VM. So here you can see that that VM is now running on VME2. Well, if I select here VME1 in that drop-down box and I click Save Changes, well, at that moment, at this right moment, there is a live migration, a vMotion running in the background. How can I see that? Well, when I go to History and I have to do a refresh, you see that that move server already finished. And so if I go back now to my instances view and I go to my Alma VM01, well, at that moment you see that my Alma VM01 VM is now running on all the same hosts. So you can perfectly change that by going to that Manage Placement option. Second question is then, of course, what about a storage vMotion? Well, a storage vMotion is a little bit different. For those who paid attention, maybe you saw it already. Well, I go back again, not on my instance, but on my VM. Well, manage placement is that vMotion live migration. To do a storage vMotion, I have to go back to reconfigure. So I showed you earlier already reconfigure, well, where you can change the CPU, the memory, the storage, the network interfaces. Well, now if you take a good look here, I have my root volume of 10 gig of that VM, and you can see now that this one is sitting on my NFS on NAS data store. Well, in my drop down box, if I select now, for instance, my Alletra MP, and I click on reconfigure, well, what do you think what will happen then? Well, at that moment, of course, I will move that QCOW file from my NFS data store to my Alletra data store. Or if you create a data store 1, 2, and 3 on your MSA or your whatever other storage device, well, those data stores that you created in that drop down box here, you can select those data stores, you hit the reconfigure button, and then that online storage migration will happen at that moment as well. Other options, HA and DRS. So HA, high availability, and distributed resource scheduler is how it is called in the VMware environment. Well, how is that placement done? Well, watch out. Quite important here is that HA and DRS in a VMware cluster is configured on cluster level. Well, let it be clear that in VM Essentials, this is not done on cluster level, but on virtual machine level. Okay, so I am back again here on my virtual machine. I go to Actions. I go back to Manage Placement. Remember where we could do that, vMotion live migration, right? Well, quite important parameter here is a thing called placement strategy. And as you can see, the placement strategy is by default on auto. But we have a few options in here. Auto placement strategy is technically like it is in VMware called DRS. Auto placement means that that VM will be placed, will be running on a host with the most available resources. So if I have two hosts, VME1 and VME2 in my cluster, and VME1 is running at 90% and VME2 is running at 5%, well, at that moment, this VM will be placed from one host in the cluster to the other host in the cluster. Only when there is a saturation of one host and not on the other one. So that is auto, and this is the default, because there is another option called failover. Now failover is then not automatic. So this is like HA, high availability. That VM, Alma VM01, will stay running on VME1 even if that host is saturated at 99%. As long as that host is up and running, that VM will be there. Only when the host fails, when the host is not available anymore, at that moment that VM will be failed over to that other host in the cluster. Okay, so automatic is proactive failover. Failover is reactive, only when the host is gone. Now, we have auto and failover. There is a third option in that drop-down box, which is called pinned. Now, what is a pinned VM? Well, pinned means, not automatic and no failover. That VM is pinned on that host. If that host goes down, the VM will go down and will stay down until you, the administrator, will power on that VM manually yourself on another host. So that is pinned. Okay, so be aware we have three options: automatic, failover, and pinned. You can find that on VM level. So don't look for HA and DRS on cluster level, because this is something that you can configure on VM level. So you can have a set of VMs on failover and another set of VMs on automatic for some kind of use case that you would like. The next thing in my list is affinity rules. Well, now for affinity rules, this is effectively something that we're going to configure on cluster level. Where can I find my cluster? Well, we are now in the compute view. Well, we move to the clusters view. So I have one cluster called the VME cluster with two hosts in there, VME1 and VME2. Well, here's a tab now called resources. And in that tab, resources, this is where you can find those so-called affinity groups. And so I have one affinity group already called divide domain controllers. And so the affinity type is keep separate. So when you click on add, you get this pop-up. You can give it a name, keep together VMs, separate VMs. And then in that type, you can select yourself, keep together, or keep separate. And then now let's say I want to have my Alma VMs together for some kind of reason. Well, at that moment, I'm going to say keep together. I'm going to activate, I'm going to enable that group, because you can disable it as well. And at that moment in my servers list, I'm going to type in here Alma, and then I'm going to select all my three Alma VMs. So there you go. So I selected Alma VM01, -2, and -3. I want to keep them together and then give it a name, and I click Save Changes. Well, at that moment, I created this affinity group, and if my Alma VMs were running on separate hosts in my cluster, well, at that moment, he will start moving those VMs now to the same host with the most available resources. So yes, affinity rules can be found under the resources tab on your cluster level. This is, by the way, as well, the place where you can find the so-called EVC mode, or the enhanced vMotion capabilities mode in a VMware cluster. Well, where can you find that and why you want to use this? Well, let's say I have a cluster, but I have 2 hosts or 3 hosts, but this is maybe a test environment or a proof of concept. or even in production, it is supported to have a Gen 9, a Gen 10, a Gen 11, and a Gen 12 server in your cluster. We have a quite large compatibility matrix on the hardware side. Well, if you have all the same generations of CPUs, you're good. However, if we have multiple types of families of generations of CPU, well, this is where you're going to use that so-called EVC mode in VMware. Well, where can you configure that inside VM Essentials? Well, you have to go to the cluster and then you click that edit cluster icon. And it's here where you can say, hey, the CPU type is x86 64-bit, because that's the only one that is supported today. But here you see that host pass-through. This is the default. Host pass-through means, well, the VM running on that host in that cluster will get the instruction set, the virtualization instruction set of that host directly in pass-through. Now, of course, if you say, hold on, I have a Gen 9, Gen 10, Gen 11, or Gen 12 in there, well, at that moment, we have a drop-down box in here where you can select at that moment the multiple types of CPU. So if you say, I have an Haswell CPU, or I have a Broadwell CPU, or I have an Epic CPU in there, and quite funny to see, hey, we have even Opteron generation 1 and even Pentium 1, 2, Pentium 3, Pentium Pro. No, I'm not gonna put my cluster now on Pentium Pro level because that instruction set is not so ideal for virtualization, but just to give you an idea of what you need to do. By the way, of course, you have to select here the lowest level of the CPU family in your cluster. Okay, so, but again, here, this is where you configure it on cluster level. You hit edit and then you select that CPU model. You change it from host pass-through to the lowest type of CPU family that you have in your cluster. And then the final option in my list that I wanted to cover is then maintenance mode. Yes, this is also an option. For instance, if you want to do maintenance on your servers, on your hosts, and you want to reboot that server, well, at that moment, what you do, typically you go to your hosts. I have VME1 in here, so when I click on VME1, I will be redirected to my compute view. At that moment, I can, for instance, see all the VMs that are running on my host. And if you say, hold on, I want to reboot that server, well, at that moment, under Actions, you can see here, Enter Maintenance. So if you enter maintenance in here, you will see at that moment, it says now provisioned. It will at that moment move all the VMs from host 1 to the other hosts in your cluster. It will take a few minutes. And at that moment, after a few minutes, it will tell you here, hey, maintenance mode. At that moment, yep, you can do all the maintenance that you want to do, reboot that server. Once that it's online back again, there's the same option here, but then exit maintenance mode. And at that moment, if the other host is saturated, at that moment, the automatic placement will kick in and will move those VMs to this host again. So on host level, Actions, enter maintenance is then the way to go. Well, I hope it was interesting, because I arrived at the end of this list now here. So I hope it gives you a good idea of how those typical daily tasks in a VMware environment, how you can do this as well in a HPE Morpheus VM Essentials environment. Hope you liked it. There's more to come. If you didn't subscribe yet, hit that button, subscribe on my YouTube channel, on the VM Essentials playlist. If you didn't download my guide already, that ultimate guide to get started with VM Essentials, go to my website hpepedia.com and get that a copy for free over there. Stay tuned and see you in the next video. Bye bye.